Hello my lovelies. Before we start with our video, I am still a tiny channel and producing these videos takes up a lot of time. So please consider subscribing, liking the video and leaving a comment. That would help immensely and allow me to continue bringing you Middle-earth content. The 19 Rings of Power, the story of the forging of the rings. This will be a 3-part series of the Rings of Power. The second part will try to explain the reasons Celebrimbor forged the rings in the first place, and how and when the Guild of Smiths in Eregion saw through Sauron, and in a final attempt saved the 3 Rings of Power. The third and last video will be the story of the One Ring. 3 rings for the Elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. 9 for mortal men doomed to die. 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadow lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. The ring verse always gets me. One thing does stand out here. The first part is most likely Elven lore, oral history from the days the rings were forged, to explain how many rings of power were made and who were the wielders of those 19 and the one master ring. Sauron's lines and most likely the spell to create the One Ring start with 1 ring to rule them all. You even hear the change in meter in this part of the verse. The forging of the 19 Rings of Power and the One Master Ring was the main event of the Second Age, next to the drowning of Numenor. The rings played a pivotal part in the rise and fall of the Dark Lord, and they are themselves a source of power, and at least the 3 Elven rings as well as the One Ring were sentient. First, let us categorize the 19 rings. 7 rings given to the 7 lords of the 7 tribes of the dwarves were the least effective ones. They were crafted first out of the 19. I'm not saying they had less magic or were less powerful. Tolkien describes it simply as the effect the rings had on the dwarves was different and lesser than, for example, the 9 rings of men. But that was more based on the nature of dwarves than the power of the ring themselves. The 9 rings for men were crafted just after the 7 and were way more effective. They prolonged the lives of the ring bearer. They enhanced the powers and gifts the bearer already had, and they slowly corrupted them and bound them to the One Ring. The bearers became slaves to the One Ring. That was never the case for the Dwarven Rings, and again, this probably was based on the nature of men rather than the power of the rings. I'll explain why I think that in a bit. The 3 Elven rings have to stand out here, as they never were tainted by Sauron, but they were made by the creator of the other 16, Celebrimbor, the last living descendant of the former High King of the Noldor, Fëanor, who fittingly was also the creator of the Silmarils. They were the most powerful out of the 19 and forged 90 years after Celebrimbor crafted the first Rings of Power, and just 10 years before Sauron forged the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom. Before we rank the rings and explain their powers, we need to understand what their original purpose actually was. Because Sauron did not intend the 16 for men and dwarves. Originally, his plan must have been to enslave and corrupt the elves with their own doing. He wanted the heir of Fëanor, creator of the Silmarils, the most precious objects the world would ever see, to forge his rings. Powerful magical weapons bound to his will, disguised as beautiful, harmless gifts. This has always been the trickery of Sauron. He knew he could not defeat the elves, nor could he defeat the Númenóreans, as he would never be able to defeat them standing united, which, beginning of the Second Age, they still did. I never fully will understand why he didn't think of dwarves, but especially men, right from the get-go. He must have known it would be way easier to corrupt men instead of elves. He knew men were weaker than elves, did not have their centuries of wisdom and knowledge of the dealings of the world. He witnessed with his own eyes during the Second Age that men have become greedy, and even the promised race of the Numenoreans went from teachers to masters, as mid-Second Age they started colonizing Middle-earth and depleting the lands. The elves, although diminished in the Second Age, still ruled over powerful kingdoms and lands in the Second Age. Galadriel, Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, Elrond, they all were allied and united. So I understand Sauron's main goal in ruling over Middle-earth would be to either get the elves on your side, get rid of them, or, well, deceive them. He knew he would never get them on his side. He killed Galadriel's brother, was partly responsible for Elrond's parents' death, Celebrimbor's ancestors' death. You get the idea. He also knew they were still too powerful, although they were diminished, and so what was left was deceit. So that part I do understand. But did he really think he could deceive all elves, or even a few of their leaders? With Galadriel, we had an elf and ruler that was older than the sun, that was illuminating Middle-earth itself. There were wise lawmasters like Elrond that knew what had happened in the centuries before the time of the forging, and how Sauron and his master Melkor had tried to enslave the world before. How would magic rings, powerful as they were, really corrupt the hearts and minds of such powerful and wise beings? How did he not plan to give the rings to men right from the get-go? He knew deceiving mankind and turning their hearts had worked before. His master persuaded former good men to aid in his quest in ruling over Middle-earth during battles of the First Age. Melkor rallied up mankind against each other. Sauron must have known he could do the same once more. There were Black Numenoreans worshipping Melkor all over Middle-earth. There were enough men fed up with the overpowered Numenoreans claiming and depleting their lands. Anyway, let's not dwell on this too long, but I never understood why the 16 were intended for elves in the first place. Leave a comment if you feel the same or if you have any thoughts on this. Okay, so no, Sauron originally never planned to give the rings Celebrimbor forged under his tutelage to men and dwarves, but that is where they ended. So let's look at the events and the timeline. In 1500, Celebrimbor started to craft the 16 rings, first the 7, then the 9. My guess is that must have happened over a time span of around 50 years. In the year 1590, he crafted the 3 Elven rings. Why and how, I will explain in the second video of this series. But what is important is that he did not want Sauron, aka Anatar, to know of this. But at that time, Sauron hasn't crafted the One Ring yet. What would happen 10 years later? So why did Celebrimbor forge the rings in secret? Was he a traitor? Did he suspect something was off? Did he plan the rings for the specific elves he later gave them to? We know who they were given to in the first place: Galadriel, Gil-galad, and then to Círdan. 2 of those, Gil-galad and Galadriel, were relatives of his, and we know both suspected something was off with Anatar, and they refused to take counsel and interact with the alleged advisor sent by the Valar. So crafting rings for over 90 years for Sauron must have made the smith curious of why and for what purpose, and my best guess is he held counsel with the 3 ring bearers and possibly even Elrond, and came to the decision they had been right all along, and he made the preparations in forging their own rings unknown and therefore untouched by whoever Anatar was. Again, we will talk about his motives and ambitions in the second video, but this is really important to understand why the 3 Elven rings were made in the first place and what differentiates them from the other 16. Sauron then in 1600 crafted the Master Ring in the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, probably the place in Middle-earth where black magic and evil was at its strongest. Melkor's spirit and all the malice of the OG Dark Lord still dwelt in that place, and therefore the magic and the creation of the One Ring is stronger and stands out to all the other rings that were ever made. It was a one-time masterpiece, just like Fëanor created centuries ago with the Silmarils. In 1600, Sauron was unaware of the 3 Elven rings. The 3 ring bearers already were wearing and using them, though. The moment Sauron forged the one and put it on his finger, the 3 Elven ring bearers were made aware of the creation of the one. This is what was said about the seat of Sauron at the Council of Elrond. The change in the wizard's voice was astounding. Suddenly, it became menacing, powerful, harsh as stone. A shadow seemed to pass over the high sun, and the porch for a moment grew dark. All trembled, and the elves stopped their ears. Never before has anyone dared to utter words of that tongue in Imlaris, Gandalf the Grey, said Elrond, as the shadow passed and the company breathed once more. And let us hope that no one will ever speak it here again, answered Gandalf. Nonetheless, I do not ask your pardon, Master Elrond, for if that tongue is not soon to be heard in every corner of the West, then let us all doubt aside that this thing is indeed what the wise have declared. The treasure of the enemy, fraught with all his malice, and it did linger a great part of his strength of old. Out of the black ears come the words that the smith of Eregion heard, and knew that they had been betrayed. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. So Gandalf confirms here that the 3 Elven ring bearers heard Sauron speaking the ring verse and spellbound the ring. This happened telepathically. The elves obviously were not present at Mount Doom, but their rings were bound now, and the One Ring, as Celebrimbor sadly must have used the magic Sauron had taught him. It didn't matter Sauron didn't know of the rings. The magic used to craft them now connected the rings and the bearers. The elves immediately must have taken their rings off and hide their locations and their thoughts from the now master ring and its bearer. But it was too late. Sauron also learned of the existence of the 3 and knew Celebrimbor had betrayed him. In the year 1695, almost a century after he crafted his master ring, he went to reclaim the rings, including the 3 Elven rings. He invaded Eregion with a massive army the Noldor elves could not withstand. Gil-galad in Lindon sent aid. The army was led by Elrond. The Noldor king even sent an SOS to the Númenóreans to aid. The Noldor elves could hold Sauron's forces at bay for 2 years, but finally were outnumbered, and in 1697 Eregion's capital, Ostinethil, fell. Celebrimbor was tortured to reveal the whereabouts of the 19. Sauron got his hands at the 16, but not the Elven ones. They were no longer in Eregion. Elrond had to flee and actually founded Rivendell after this loss. The dwarves of Moria and the elves of Lorien actually saved Elrond's ass with heavy casualties, and as a result, the doors of Moria were shut for centuries. Sauron had what he wanted, magic objects to give out to enslave powerful leaders to win the war over Middle-earth. But let us get back to the rings and their actual powers. 7 rings for the dwarves. So what are their powers? How do they rank? 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. So according to Unfinished Tales, the 7 were the first of the rings of power that were created. The creation of the rings took place in the year 1500. That doesn't mean they all were created at the same time though. My guess is one by one Celebrimbor and Sauron forged the 7 rings over the time span of probably 10 or 20 years. Just like with anything in life, over time your skill and your skill set grow. Tolkien tells us they made other lesser rings even before the 7 dwarven ones. Probably that was a kind of trial and error, a training lesson. We don't know the names of the 7 dwarf lords that were given the rings by Sauron, nor if it was Sauron himself, Sauron in fair form aka Anatar. He was a shapeshifter. He could even have appeared as Aule, the father of dwarves himself. But the number implies it must have been the 7 clans of dwarves: Durinsfolk, Firebeards, Broadbeams, Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklogs, and Stonefoots. We also do not know if the rings all look the same, or like the 3 elven ones all had different stones. What we do know is they did not work as Sauron intended them to work. Why did men turn into wraiths, but the dwarven wielders of the rings did not? Dwarves were not created by the one god, Eru, but by the smith Aule, a powerful demigod in Tolkien's world. And they actually were given the power of sturdiness, stubbornness, and therefore always resisted the power and the temptation of the evil lords, Melkor and after him Sauron. I do ask myself, though, why Sauron still gave them the rings. He was a pupil of Aule himself and once, and knew and learned from him, so he must have been informed of the nature of dwarves. Was he so sure of the powers of the rings? I guess he simply had no alternative. The elves as bearers were out of question after he attacked them. They weren't that many powerful men in all of Middle-earth to hand out 16 rings to, so he just tried his luck with the rings and the dwarves, is my guess. Seeing how rich and greedy they got over time, he must have thought, why not use that to his advantage one day? Sauron always thought 2 steps ahead. So, what were their actual powers? We don't know that they made the owners invisible, but we do know they made them greedier and more successful in their endeavors of finding all the treasures of the world and getting richer and richer. All dwarven kingdoms grew immensely, wealthier during those days, and I guess just like with the human bearers, the rings prolonged their lives of the ring bearers. There's a version in where Celebrimbor gave out one of the 7 to Durin, the 3rd, instead of Sauron giving out all the rings. It makes sense, they were close and I'd even say friends, and they had created the West Gate of Moria together, and during that time the Noldor elves and Celebrimbor and the dwarves of Moria were close. But it doesn't make sense looking at the timeline. He must have given out the rings before Sauron sacked Eregion, and during the 90 years of him having the rings before Sauron crafted the One Ring, he did not know what Sauron wanted to do with the rings, so why would he give out one of them anyway? In the end, the rings did fulfill their purpose in a way, because they partly did lead to the downfall and ruins of some of the dwarven kingdoms. Word spread around the extreme wealth of the dwarves, and dragons could not resist golden treasures. 4 out of the 7 were consumed by dragonfire, and Sauron managed to capture the last remaining 3, including Durin's ring in the 3rd age. 9 rings for mortal men. I do not want to dive too deep into this. I am planning on doing a ring raid video where I explain the story in more depth. I think looking at the timeline and the events of the time might help to understand what the 9 meant. Sauron got hold of the 16 when he sacked Eregion in 1697. That means from that time on he could have started giving out the rings. We have no dates for that, sadly. But we do know the Nazgul first appeared in the year 2251. So we have a time span of 554 years. I do not think he turned any of the 9 in the span of a year into a ring raid. Those things took time. He did choose those specific men because they were strong. So it must have taken some time to turn them and bend them to his and the ring's will. I guess the Witch King was turned last. Go check out my Who's the Witch King video if you want me to explain which 2 Numenorean kings I suspect might be the leader of the 9. Video is linked here in the description. The rings could have been plain or held an individual stone. Again, remember they originally were made for the elves, and elves loved bling. They brought lots of jewelry from the Undying Lands to Middle-earth. So I guess Celebrimbor did not just forge 9 plain gold bands. Maybe the stones in the rings even stood for certain powers the 9 might gain or expand. Let me know your theories in the comment section. So what were the actual powers? The ring in a way enhanced whatever talent or gift the bearer already held, a bit like the One Ring. For a magic user or sorcerer, that must have sounded very tempting. For someone that was a great warrior of his time, that also must have sounded like something they would not hesitate wearing. I do not think the rings came with a manual telling the wielder what was possible and not. They definitely did not know what their fate would be. Magic is a mystery in Tolkien's world. What we do know of the ring wraiths is they grew in power and status, and the ring made them immortal, well, at least for a time. Obviously, the magic came with a price. They lost all their humanity and free will over time. I guess the more they used the ring, the faster they fell under the spell of the one. I do not think the 9 were ranked. I think the men he chose to be the 9 were ranked in their status and capabilities from the get-go. Again, my theory is the Witch King, the de facto leader, was from the beginning the strongest and most powerful out of the 9. As I speculate, he was a Númenórean king. I also wonder how Sauron managed to give them out, and in what form. Did he shapeshift into a human, into a king of men himself, into a Maiar, into an elf? Maybe all of the above, depending on who he was talking to. If the bearer was a black Númenórean, which at least 3 were, he might even have shown up as the later form of Sauron. He certainly did not disguise himself as an elf for that mission. I'm excited to maybe see that in the upcoming Lord of the Rings show, by the way. So let's summarize. They most likely were similar in strength and power. They might have had jewels, as they originally were intended for elves, and they enhanced the power the wielder had, plus they granted immortal life. All that for the price of slowly enslaving the owner of the ring. Men were not more powerful than dwarves per se, but the effect the ring had on them was way stronger than the dwarven ones, and they were crafted a bit later, so in a way I would say they rank above the Dwarven Rings. The 3 Elven Rings. I do not want to lose myself in detail here. I think this could be a standalone video, but the forging culminated in the creation of the 3 Elven Rings, Vilja, Nenya, Narja. Vilja, the ring of sapphire and therefore blue, was also called the Ring of Air and was supposed to be the mightiest of the 3 rings. The ring's power was to heal and preserve and control elements like air and water. Remember the scene where Elrond cast the water to drown the Nazgul and their horses? Yes. Gil-galad was the first bearer, but he gave Elrond the ring, who used it after Sauron's fall at the end of the Second Age. Nenya, the white ring made of mithril, holding an adamant stone, was also called the Ring of Water. It had always been worn by Galadriel. The main powers of the ring was preservation and most likely protection, and that was exactly what Galadriel used the ring for after the fall of Sauron. She guarded the borders of Lorien and used the ring to grow fertile lands in Middle-earth. As this was the only ring that was made with the intention for the bearer, Celebrimbor specifically made the ring for Galadriel, and she was the most powerful elf amongst the users. I always wondered how Nenya is not counted as the strongest out of the 19, but okay. The last of the 3 was Narja, the Ring of Fire, and it held a ruby in its center. The ring got round a bit. The first wielder was Gil-galad, who gave it to Círdan, who upon the arrival of the Istari in Middle-earth in the Third Age gave it to Gandalf. The ring's main powers were to inspire others to resist tyranny and domination and evil. Sounds like it was actually made for Gandalf. Interesting fact about the rings before we come to an end. The elves and Gandalf took the rings back to the Undying Lands, most likely as a token to never forget what happened, a reminder of the dark days, but also the hope the rings brought. The powers of all the 3, and all rings actually, faded away when the one was destroyed. Also, the 3 were connected to the Silmarils, and they where the Silmarils ended up. Vilja, Elrond's ring, mirrored the air where the Silmaril ended up. The guardian of the Silmaril was no one else than Elrond's own father, Eärendil, who on his flying ship Vingolot guarded the skies above the world. Nenya, the Ring of Water, Galadriel's ring, mirrored the Silmaril that ended up with Fëanor's son Maglor, who died and who cast it in the sea doing it. And the last ring, Narja, the Ring of Fire, mirrored the fate of the third Silmaril that was cast into a fiery pit by Medros, another of the 7 sons of Fëanor. So overall, it becomes clear the Elven Rings stand out here. Their creation was with good intentions, and they were used to do good, and their wielders, as much as their powers, were stronger than the other 16 rings of power. I still find it hard to compare the 16 and the 3 because they were so different. I hope you enjoyed this one. I sure did enjoy writing it. Leave a comment if you made it this far. Until the next one, my lovelies. Bye bye.